So we got a lot of time, so I have a bunch of slides, but feel free to interrupt me and ask questions. I'm sort of here to transfer as much of my understanding and show you what I'm working on and sort of give you some ideas and maybe some things that might be useful for you. So I'm going to go through what essentially is a stock presentation, but feel free to interrupt and just start asking questions. So most of my work the last 5 years has been in this area of games and health. But primarily, I spend a lot of my time in terms of over the last decade looking at this notion of that games and game technologies have lots of opportunities and applications beyond entertainment. And I work with organizations, corporations, individuals who are seeking to use games and game technologies to advance whatever their mission may be. I also do some work with some indie game developers in terms of helping them hone their business strategies and ideas. All of it kind of coming together to sort of think about, beyond the notion of where we always are and sort of what's going to be next. I always start off my presentations by telling you what I'm playing or some of the things that I'm playing lately. I find that in this space, you see a lot of people talking about how great games can be in all kinds of other fields, and then when you ask them, like, how much do you really understand games, they couldn't produce this slide, or if they did, it would show you like Pac-Man and Asteroids, right? Which I always love Pac-Man and Asteroids, but those aren't the last games that I played. And also, I encourage all the speakers at my conferences to produce the same sort of slides because sometimes it's a great way to find out about a game that I didn't know about. So, you can probably recognize some of the games up there. But more importantly, I try to play a wide diversity of games. And also, my son Everett is with me today. He's been introducing me to other games like Stickman, which was kind of an interesting sort of Sims type game that's played online. And had some very interesting ideas. And then we've been playing Civ Clicker, Candy Box, Candy Box, which is sort of this whole kind of retro idea of like how can you distill a game down to almost its most core mathematical formulas. And so very interesting because they all run in a browser with the most minimal kinds of graphics and tech. But of course, when you're thinking about using games in a large context for health or other kinds of applications like education, we're not always trying to chase down the latest and greatest platform. We are not building these games for Xbox One or PS4. And so really seeing what the cutting edge of doing something in just a browser-based platform and finding some really interesting games is a great way to expand the kinds of patterns and understandings and engineering patterns that I need when I'm sort of looking at a particular problem set. So I encourage you always, if you're working in this space or you play games, to share the same. So the general idea of games for health is this sort of promise, right? They identify and make available comparative advantages all of video games have to offer. So a lot of my work, whether it be in health or education, is really seeking this notion of what's the true comparative advantage. Because we're the sort of, for lack of a better term, the new kid on the block. And it's sort of like if you're talking to me about your problem, I would want to assume that you either have a special reason to be talking to me, or at the very least be able to explain to me why everything else that you're doing or hasn't been working to the point, right? And we're all tracing these intractable problems. This is true of technology, right? Education, optimizing it is an intractable problem. We're just constantly trying to do that. There's certain things in health, behavior change, the obesity epidemic, which we started to make some dents on, not necessarily through games, but in general. But these problems look very large. It's an all hands on deck. But what we want to do is not just build games for game's sake. If I want to do that, I'll go compete in entertainment games. So what we want to think about, though, is this notion that games can make things accessible and that we can model and play with health. And we can create that sort of core engagement around active and healthy lifestyle development. And so we think about how we engage and motivate people, how we create information architectures that help them change and support that notion of change, and then how we can use games in the form of software and in the form of media to create scalability and sustainability for these kinds of interventions. And so what we're talking about is this idea in the most distilled way of an active form of communication, which ideally gets better results. That is what we're seeking. And then, as a result of that, we're helping people make better choices when we're talking mostly around health. And of course, games are all about choice. So you would think that to some degree, there's some natural congruency there. And we could unpack this quite a bit. I do like an all-day tutorial about serious games and how you do this, but we'll plow through and sort of talk a little bit more about health. So we can think about how we can take each of those ideas and then start to break them into smaller components. Like, what do we really mean by engaging and motivating? And what kinds of things in games and the media form of games do we kind of draw upon to do that? And then we think, like, what is it that we're actually trying to accomplish from the user standpoint? Like, engaging and motivating them is sort of a lot around, why do I start? Why do I pick this thing up and get involved in it? And then changing and supporting, we're thinking about, like, how do we keep them involved in all of this? How do we keep them to unpack all of that model that's there, all of that understanding, that emotion, the learning that may be in there, and sort of get into that notion of why do I keep enjoying playing this, and then scaling and sustaining, we could talk about in two ways. So in the first way I inferred was more sort of how can we get these interventions spread through networks all across the world very quickly, the way a viral game or any kind of viral piece of media takes hold. But the other part is how can we sustain someone who might need to work on something for 3 or 6 months? Learning to eat better is not something that you just do in one day. I mean, unless you want to give up cupcakes. Okay, so why do I keep doing these things? Why do I get further and further through that sustained engagement and get into the immersiveness of those decisions and ultimately build up my self-efficacy towards them? Now, another way we look at the games for health space, and we've done this for serious games as well across multiple domains, is a friend of mine, Peter Smith, who's a professor at UCF, and I periodically sort of create these cross-section grids, right? So across the top, we're thinking like, okay, there are games for health for personal use, for professional practice that we've observed. We see a lot of use of games in research and academia, and then public health. So we sort of took some different categories where we saw clusters of work, and then we sort of looked and said, well, what kinds of areas do we see it going in another way? So we think about preventive, therapeutic directly, assessment, education and training, informatics, and even production in terms of producing new data or some other piece of work. And what's interesting about this is you can start to put in, and maybe at this point in time, you think of it as conjecture, sort of like, oh, what could go here? What is going here? But in general, I've seen at least one or more projects, let alone one or more products brought to market or projects brought to a public-facing space that fills this entire grid. And what's important to understand about this isn't any single individual part, and I can do this for the entirety of serious games where we go education, health, defense, so we go across the sectors of a typical economy, is that when you look at it this way and you make and I show you that we can fill those boxes in with at least one or more, identified examples, what my point is that you now start to think of games as a strategic opportunity within health, or a strategic opportunity for any organization if we were going up one level beyond health. And as such, my quest in terms of talking to large organizations and others is to say this is a strategic opportunity the way we look at social media, the way we look at web, the way we look at other forms of media and software. And yet at the moment, still, we're really dealing with an industry of dabbling and sort of toes in the water and a lot of apprehensive understanding of what to do or not. There are very few organizations that have someone who is even part-time but say full-time. So what I mean by that is that it's a constant need that they're charged with to keep their eye on this space, to look for investment opportunities, to look for things that they can use and do. The way most large organizations have somebody within that chief marketing organization whose job it is to do social media, whose job it is to know the web, and where it cuts across the entirety of an organization, from their internal facing to their public facing to their partner facing opportunities. I would make the point that I think we can do the same in games, but we're not quite there yet. Now, one of the reasons we're not quite there is because I think a lot of people got diverted to this notion of gamification. So let's bring this right up front, because for the last 1.5 to 2 years, I've been dealing with trying to help people understand the difference between gamification as a term and games in terms of what we talk about when you talk to a game designer and say, I want to build a game. And I've literally met chief technology officers of large Fortune 500 companies who have said to me, yes, we're doing games, and then they show me their gamified HRA, okay? That's not necessarily what I would think of as a game. So you have this term called gamification that came along. And what it originally sort of started to mean when we talked about this larger idea of taking assets from games was this notion that we could take these attributes. We could take this idea of narrative. We could take really cool interfaces. I designed an interface for DARPA looking at UAVs. Right? They asked us, could we get some game designers together to look at how UAVs would be managed once the pilots weren't behind them, and it was a bunch of flying web servers. And so I brought together Larry Holland and Noah Falstein, who used to work at LucasArts. Larry Holland's best known for doing X-Wing versus TIE Fighter. So this was a person who was asked to think about, sort of fictional interfaces to Star Wars universe. And so we built this sort of notion of what would a new kind of command and control center look like for that. So it was like engaging game people along, the ideas and the talents that they had that were inherent to theirs. So we had this notion that you could take these pieces. Obviously, we wanted to build full games, but then we have actual games like Remission, which is about fighting cancer in a body, or Play Forward, a project I worked on with the Yale School of Medicine that's aimed at helping kids understand risk and risk vectors in their life. Really simple. Games and gamification are not the same thing, but they get conflated all the time, especially in corporate America. Now, what we ended up with, though, when we got to the gamification sort of side of things was these companies like Big Door, Badgeville, Bunchball. And what they really were doing were points and badges. They were trying to sort of rip Xbox Live, marry it with traditional industrial psychology, call it games because games are cool, right? And make somebody go, when they said gamification, what they wanted dancing in that person's head was, was Oblivion. It was Minecraft. It was, your favorite video games, right? But what they were then saying was, we're going to give you these things like levels and achievements and other stuff. Nothing necessarily wrong with it, except it was, I consider it, bait and switch, as I used to say, or still do say. They said you could cut off part of the cow that you want and ride the rest home. So there's a lot of backlash. You can see my friend Ian Bogos and others will talk about this. But I have to live in a world where the philosophical battle is defined, but then set aside. And what I would tell you is that really what we're talking about with gamification is this notion of a gamut of available applications to games. And if you go on the left side of the equation, you'll have something like MyFitnessPal, right? I'd call it an app. It is what it is. Now you go one step over, you got Jane McGonigal's Super Better project, where she sort of kind of thought about, this notion of achieving things, this notion of questing for a certain level of personal outcome in life. Like I want to eat better, or I want to handle my asthma better, or I want to get over my concussion, which inspired her to make that game. So everything is sort of like, put in this gaming language, battle bad guys, activate power-ups, complete today's quests and things like that. So it's a little bit more towards the game side than, say, MyFitnessPal. Both, MyFitnessPal, incredibly successful, Super Better, very interesting, but not as successful at the moment. Then you got Healthy Heroes, a project out of Sweden. This was more around movement and sort of active lifestyle, but you could see with the panda fighting, they're trying to actually build a more game-like motif. So it's sort of Super Better, but with game graphics, or at least game avatars, or stills, or whatever it is. Now, Goldwalker was an experiment we did for Humana, myself and Larry Holland, and what we did there was, as you moved your phone to, you could move your character around a map, and you were playing a traditional sort of strategy game where you're trying to marshal resources around a map of 1849 California and dig the gold out of the hills. And so the more you move, if you needed to move up to Placerville to get your gold, you needed to move yourself in the real world. And so we had this notion that we could take the accelerometer and turn it into a real part of playing what would essentially be a traditional game. And then, of course, you go one step over and you've got something like Remission, which, it's a little dated at the moment, but it essentially looked like when it was released, a 3D PlayStation 2 game. Now, We can argue over what's more effective or what's not more effective. But the fact is, these things will exist in this area. And if you're going to look at these spaces, there may be reasons to do either one. My only ask is don't call one games. Don't call one games when it's not. Call it, it's like we're moving up this sort of gamut. Think about it that way. And think also that your audience isn't going to necessarily care. Right? They're going to, I know people who have 3 or 4 of these types of things all on the same phone, right? Like if you look at someone's iPhone, their Android phone, you can see that they've got all kinds of different things that take care of whatever they consider their health. One thing might be Runkeeper, but more with a game, or they might have Run Zombies, Zombies Run, I mean, right next to each other. And they'll use them differently, and they'll experience them differently. And they might call one a game and one not a game. They might not even care. Now, we see gamification taking forms like a lot of stuff is mobile and browser-based. We could talk about just the sort of general structure of it. An activity generates a metric, right? That activity could be app-based, self-report, third-party, sensor, social media. There's a data point and frequency going on, so that's generating a data point, but at a certain level of frequency. And then all of that data, and that may be very little, but moves into what we would call this sort of gamified app or game. And then the end user's presented with some sort of decision as a result of that trigger. And then it loops all the way back. So I ran 6 miles, that gives me some sort of decision. Maybe I have to run 4 more to get to the next level and beat my friends. I mean, it's a lot of that sort of stuff that we see. And then ultimately, the end user decision and the metrics generated are sort of brought together, and maybe we can see some behavioral understanding. Though much way we see behavioral understanding in terms of just looking at websites. Did they click the red button or the green button? Now, the issue with this is, again, looking at pros and cons. The big reason that gamification versus games sort of became this kind of side view, or is still potentially popular, is that it's easy to implement. It's clear to the user, it's widely applicable, it's inexpensive, and it's easily cross-platform, right? I give you an app, I say it tracks your steps, I tell you that if the first person to 10,000 steps wins the prize, I maybe even put $25 in an office pool, and I call it a game for whatever that gets me. And I can push this through in a web browser with about less than $20,000 of engineering, okay? And, but now we have the cons. It's commodified, right? Virgin Health Miles, Shape Up, Kias, they all have the same thing, right? It's almost too simplified. Is it really that unique? A lot of these things tend to tie to extrinsic rewards, and we've seen some of the data on that. They work for a little bit and then not for much, $5 to clean your room. How well is that working? Yeah. See, I brought you here for a reason. And there's too much self-report going on in some of these apps, whether they be games or otherwise. So we have this sort of structural problem with gamification, and to some degree, not just gamification, but we see this in health apps in general, right? There's an over-reliance on self-report so far. And is the underlying behavior frequent enough for interesting interactions? So this is something that I've noticed. How many people have a Y things or a Fitbit scale? I had one until it broke. So let's make a game about a Wi-Fi scale, right? Okay, we're gonna commit to that. Somebody comes to us and says, I hear about gamification, it's really big, I make scales, I wanna get people on them, I want you to make a game, and I start to explain this whole structure to them, right? And my biggest part is, where are we on frequency? How many times do you step on a scale? A day, once a day, maybe twice, once in the morning, once at night. You get into that whole, what happens over the course of the day or overnight. So maybe twice if we're lucky. Anybody ever play a video game where you press one button once a day? Right. I mean, there's a frequency issue.
I did, actually.
Okay, was it good?
It was interesting.
It was probably better designed than my Wi-Fi scale game. So, anyway, but my point is that most games do not follow that, and there is a reason. So extrinsic rewards alone are costly and degrade, and really, are these the games that you're looking for? That would be my question. And when you talk to people who are higher up in organizations and they're hearing games and gamification, they're seeing their kids on their Xbox and they're coming in and hearing this gamification, you can see how all of a sudden they're not paying attention enough and they're just bought in, right? My point is if we separate them out, they both have strengths and weaknesses. But often we find people are doing one thing and then not the other. And so you have a lot of startups in this space. Some of them even funded. But this is mostly what they're doing, right? They're gamifying steps, maybe a little bit of nutrition. I've seen some disease management stuff, nothing that I'm like really enamored with. I mean, the vast majority of everybody on here is doing steps as their key thing. So one of the things, now another thing, so you hear gamification a lot. Then another thing that you hear, regardless of health or otherwise, but you hear it a lot in health is, I'm looking for engagement, I'm looking for motivation, right? That's why, you game guys, you all understand motivation. Kids are just, stuck on these machines all day. Everybody loves, they're all motivated. But, you look at like what BJ Fogg talks about, and the first thing he says is, okay, step one, boost motivation and sustain it over time. And he says, bad solution, right? So you're coming to me and you're saying, I'm looking for motivation, and they don't consider anything else, right? Their notion of what they consider they're gonna get from games is motivation. It starts on M and it ends on N, and that's what they're looking for, right? Because they're not getting it in anything else, and they think that's the But BJ's work and research shows that doesn't necessarily work. And then he talks about a better solution, simple behavior, build over time. So now you want to think about how a game might do that. And then a good solution is to have both, right? And so what I would argue is that maybe the bigger thing about games that we have to think about is their notion of interface and information architecture. The way a game presents information and gets you involved in that information is more important than its amazing ability to motivate you. And that if we focus on motivation and we discount the larger ideas around information architecture, then we've basically discounted a huge opportunity for comparative advantage. And we've basically we're playing in the shallow end of the pool, which for most corporate executives is exactly where they want to be. So what might be next if we talk about gamification next? So we would have more data and frequency of input, especially for more biometrics. We'd enable a richer set of behaviors and feedback loops. So I'm using all the gamification language here, but I'm saying like maybe we could make it better. Maybe we could move beyond points, badges, challenges. We could get into the real sort of interesting stuff around games, narratives, stronger strategies, thinking about how this world comes together. More gameplay, not more reward. Integration across applications. So one of the things that I think SuperBetter could have really done was rather than just house all of the decision making right there, like MyFitnessPal is doing, like Runkeeper is doing, start to integrate to other apps that become that very, very good app for, say, eating, or a good app for some other health behavior, and then become the sort of meta app, the meta game across all of them. And then of course we want to see the integration with PHRs, HRAs, and then of course health professionals. And I think we're talking about this notion of motivational devices, right? Like so that we have this larger habit-forming information architecture that we build across all of our apps, across all of our devices, across all of our sensors. I've even talked about this notion of like object-oriented health behavior change, right? Where one particular app handles one particular element of a larger, more complex model of health behavior change, and then another one does it, and then almost like SCORM, which, from an e-learning perspective, talks about learning objects, right? We could have health behavior objects. We're quite a ways away from that. But you could see how that could start to happen. Let's move on to games. Let's stop talking about gamification for a moment. These are all games for health that have been built. They're some of my favorites. And what I love about this screen is without telling you what each one does, I see a lot of really well-produced titles here. I mean, you do judge books by their cover, by the way. I've written a lot of books, and my best-selling book had the best cover. These all look like things I want to pick up and try. And in fact, you have stuff that's working on cancer adherence for chemo, things to help caretakers understand bipolar, movement, diabetes, working on Parkinson's assessment, folding proteins. This game here, this is a game about standing up out of a chair. It is a great game out of Japan. They put a Wii Fit board on the ground. They have a lot of seniors who are just sort of wheelchair bound. It's not that they can't stand up. They're just not motivated. They don't even have, they're suffering from, even a muscular, sort of self-induced muscular problem. They're not moving. They're not even standing up. Every time you stand up on the Wii board, the pressure comes up, and then this tree grows. I mean, it really grows, and it's beautiful the way it does. It's the most fun game I've ever had about standing up out of a chair. This is smoking cessation. There's some breathing techniques. The game becomes a way to learn those. Play Forward works on HIV prevention. And so you have a wide variety of things. But they all pass that sort of general test of, do these look like games? Could I put this in front of my son or his friends and say, hey, are these video games, without even asking what they're about? And he would agree. Don't disagree. Yeah, I know, you're funny. So now, let's think about the notion of what we've been doing on the Games for Health project. So, our first goal was just to necessarily get as many people who are interested in this in the same room, get them starting to share, get them starting to collaborate. Can a doctor and a game developer walk into a bar and walk out with something interesting? And in fact, that upper left-hand corner, Elude, which was built here at MIT by the Gambit Lab over in the CMS program, was the result of a Mass General child psychiatrist meeting a game developer from MIT who had been working on some things around metaphorical games representing addiction, and said, could you do the same for mental health so we could get people to understand better what someone's really going through? And so again, perfect example, when you can get people from different disciplines in the room and provide them, large amounts of alcohol, you can get innovation. Sometimes it requires sharing results and data and all that other fun stuff too. But so as we went through that, we sort of got to that point and we were wondering, what else could we do and where could this go? And so one of the great things about being an RWJF grantee is they send you to all these really cool health conferences and TED Med and a bunch of others. And so I sat in 6 years of conferences like this, just trying to soak it all up. And of course, you come to these just general conclusions. It doesn't take long to figure these out, but a lot of people don't receive adequate care. We're paying for care of illness versus an injury, but not necessarily wellness. And when we do have wellness, it's this really bad consumerized version of it versus a system-based wellness. And we have big health technologies, but traditionally they've been driving up costs. So when you talk about health technology, whether it's on a big policy level or even with smaller organizational levels, their sense is this is great. MRI machines have saved people's lives, but they're not necessarily the cost curves that people like Andy Grove and others have been associated with, which is why when you see Andy Grove talk about health technology, he gets mad because it doesn't look like anything he's represented in his career. Right? And so he's trying to figure out, why doesn't it look like the cost curves that I've been associated with? Personal health IT creating a new curve is the opportunity, and then we have most media-based behavior changes from old media. The vast majority of media-based behavior change as practice involves pamphlets, PSAs, radio commercials, television spots. In general, the CDC still spends more on that than it does on new media. Now, there's good reasons and bad reasons for that. And then, we're getting to a world where we're going to be able to run our own personal genome, our own personal, biome, all of these things. We're going to generate all of this different data, and then we're going to be able to potentially have this kind of new form of medicine. The problem, though, is that when we think about the new model of health, this is where we hope to end up. Global democratized self and social care. We get better at taking care of ourselves and our friends rather than relying on the health apparatus as it exists to do that. Right now, one of the hidden problems of healthcare in this country is if everybody who needed healthcare actually sought it from the system as currently constructed, it would fall apart. Providers paid for wellness, so we're getting to those accountable care organization type systems. We want to have an aligned forces between the system and consumerism. So right now, most consumerism, the way we talk about, thigh masters, late night television, self-help books, most of them are not aligned between our public health system, let alone our personal health system, and the opportunities of consumerism, right? We have really grand opportunities to use scalable consumer systems, much like the way Dean Kamen talks about getting together with Coke to figure out how to distribute his Sterling engine around the world. If we could find those aligned moments, they could be great. Now, we could adopt technologies that actually drive down costs. We can measure everything. We can have this notion of a constant health profile. And then ultimately, what we end up with is seductive, ubiquitous, lifelong health interface. There are not many seductive, ubiquitous, lifelong interfaces. And then at the same time, we need this new health literacy. We need a health literacy that supports this model, a health literacy that deals with the DNA model, yet at the same time, we don't have that, okay? We don't have even health literacy for the old model. And one of the biggest things that we're talking about in terms of health is that we're moving to a probabilistic-based system. It's always been that way, okay? If you talk to a doctor, that's what you'll understand. They'll just won't say it. They don't even understand it themselves half the time. The problem is that we're really bad at this, and it's only gonna get worse because now we're gonna personalize it to, okay, if we do this type of chemo with you, it might respond at this, and then we have this experimental version, and then there's this new way of doing it, and it overlays this. And I mean, forget it, right? We just don't even have that in place. And so we have some very, very large challenges ahead of us. Now, if we look again, we can see that we're getting sensors, right? We're looking at this notion of connected health through internet and health 2.0. And then we have this sort of idea of quantified health, quantified self. And then we hear this other term, positive health, that comes out of some of the work from people like Dr. Marty Seligman. And so, the way I look at this is where we're at is we're trying to figure out how can we get to you earlier in your life? How can we build a self-efficacy about healthiness that really hasn't existed before, a new kind of form of it? And then ideally, at the foundation, Paul Turini and others, and I really like this, they talk about this notion of building health assets. How do we give you health behaviors and health information and health understandings now that you put in your suitcase and you unpack them when you need them, right? Just think of it from this perspective. It doesn't help to start learning first aid the second someone's lying on the ground in front of you in need of it. We need you to know it ahead of time because we need to lower the time and distance between you and someone who can save your life. If we could just cut the time and distance in half from someone being able to provide just hands-only CPR properly to people, we'd save more people's lives, very, very simply. 10 to 40, this is a time where you go, you start to peel away from your pediatrician and you start to not necessarily, you're what I call normally healthy. You've not had a health incident, you're not born, you don't have a health condition that you've brought along with you. So there's very little reason for you to engage the system. And even if you did, honestly, you would burden the system. But maybe there's a new system that we could create that does keep you engaged so that by the time you get to needing the system, you're prepared for it. And can we, as a result, change that model of self-health? And maybe biometric games would be part of that. Here's what we've seen so far in the games for health space. We've seen games that have had large sales with very low health impact commensurate, relative to the number of sales. I mean, We Fit was $1 billion product for about 18 months worldwide at retail. If it had been a drug, it would have been in the top 10 of drug launches that year, okay? But if I walk into Nintendo and said, I just sold $1 billion of this game product that I spent, say $50 million on, I get a raise. I walk into RWJF and I say, 10, 15 million people bought this product, but less than 2% of them are probably measurably better as a result of it. Not so much. Then we see things like Remission, which had a high health impact, but it's narrow target audience. This is a game for pediatric cancer patients. Yes, go ahead.
So why is it that BFITs didn't have any impact on the
So it's had personal impacts, right? There's tons of anecdotal stories, right? Like there are definitely people that we know as a result of We Fit and what it did as a great product in and of itself, that it did change their life. My point is that if you really look at the sale and the scale of the height of it, it didn't show up. And it's, it suffers from a number of design flaws that are inherent to things that aren't necessarily Nintendo's fault, but I mean, it ended up next to the rowing machine. I know where my Wii Fit board is, right? So at the same time, Nintendo wasn't necessarily on the hook for one of those goals. It was only on the hook for the first one. And they're still investing in health, which I'll talk about in a second, but this is what we've seen, right? And then, on the other hand, Remission, the Omidyar family funded this project. It had, stellar results, but there's about, I think, if my numbers are right, 50,000 cases of pediatric cancer in the United States. I don't want to see any, but it was a great example, but within a narrow target audience. So we talk about Remission a lot, but nobody actually goes out and starts running around saying we need more of these because it doesn't hit that same scale. So it's the problem on its head. And then, of course, the vast majority of things we see are bad games with bad targets. So I'll start here and then I'll go here. Go ahead.
So could you explain
explain the high health impact?
So when remission was put into a clinical trial, it was shown to have statistically significant effects in terms of the child's self-efficacy as a cancer patient, their understanding and management of their side effects, and even they did see some level of higher utilization of chemo in their bloodstream versus control. So this was a game that resulted in its multi-site, double-blind study of having a definite impact from a health behavior change standpoint. Published in pediatrics, so a decently ranked journal. So we could say that with some level of confidence, that exposure to remission definitely was changing and supporting and improving that particular patient's life or ideally prognosis, but I don't want to go too far. My point being, we had a measurable high health impact, but with a small audience.
What were the key aspects of the game that you feel contributed?
So I don't know what I feel. I know what they tell me they feel. In one case, I think a big part of it was, they claim, was just the emotional sort of understanding of cancer that playing the game created. Okay.
What was the game?
The game was basically that you battle the cancer cells inside the body. Okay, and you use different blasts, different weapons to battle different forms of cancer. The big underlying element of it was that you really learn that you have to fight it to the very last cell, right? So we all have a basic understanding of what happens with cancer, but for younger patients, getting them to really, really understand that and to sort of see it as an emotional battle that they could partake in. And that the game was about them. That may have raised their sort of general understanding and emotional understanding of it, and that may have been transferred in. I think that there are other reasons it may have also worked. I think particularly in the study, and I've seen this in certain other types of games, be it in health or otherwise, there may have also been what I would call a sort of attention effect. So the fact that the game was introduced through child life specialists, through the nursing program, and that there was a very specific study, the kids got quite a decent amount of attention. Now, they did do a control game. The control game was Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, so it had nothing to do with health or anything else. And they did have some level where the kids were getting another game, they were getting some attention. These are problems with doing research in general. But overall, what I think the summation of remission does is it says you can take these ideas, these established ideas of media-based behavior change. You can put them in work between scientists and game developers collaborating, on an iterative basis over time, and you can produce a piece of media that can measure out with an effect. Okay, so it's held up in that sense of saying, yes, we can do this. There is some sense. The question would be, can we do it more effectively? Can we do it at greater level? And can we do it in some areas that maybe are, have an even higher impact? Certainly if I was a parent of a child with cancer, I can't think of a higher impact, but my point is really about numbers here. And then, the vast majority of things we see are bad games for bad targets. We actually call them catch the fruit games, right? Catch the fruit, not pizza. But there actually are these games. And these are people who might build a game, an independent developer or someone else, and they feel that they're doing something good here. And, psychology of priming effects aside, I don't think this is really what I meant when I started this idea of bringing together a community to build more games like Remission. What I want are more games like Remission, but that attack the things that we were associating with Wii Fit. So what do I mean by that? Yeah, so what we want to do is solve that delta between things that are successful at sales and improving their health impact. So my question would be, what kinds of things could we do that could have helped Wii Fit in and of itself? Can we move beyond disease state-based games? So there's a lot of work within disease state-based games like Remission. And then can we just get better games aimed at better targets? Better targets meaning, better fundamentally more interesting approaches to solving some of the problems and challenges as we see them. So when we start to do that and think about that, we look at, really trying to understand better what we mean by health. And so when you look at the way the WHO talks about health, they talk about it being a state of complete physical and mental and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So you're not well just because you're not sick, okay? You're well when you're reaching an optimal state of physical, mental, and social well-being. So that requires us to start thinking in bigger ways of what we mean by that. So Martin Seligman talks about this notion of positive psychology, which sometimes boils down into the happy people. But when you sit down and you talk to Martin and his students and others who really think about this, you can extrapolate it into a larger sense, which is that positive health describes being in that state beyond the mere absence of disease, but that we quest to find out that it's definable and measurable. And that we look for biological markers, psychological markers, functional markers, that we can look and see if we can instigate a sort of super health or a positive health asset that creates an improved and future health outcome. So this idea might be that you are someone who regresses to the mean from a higher state when you hit an adverse event. So for example, maybe I have a much better, higher sense of resilience. Well, maybe that's a mental sense of resilience, but along physical sense of resilience. And as a result of that, when something bad happens in my life, I recover faster. I don't fall into almost a near clinical sense of depression, thus seeking treatment, thus getting caught potentially in a bad situation. He talks. There's talking about other things, rapid wound healing and other things. We talk about looking at biological markers like around heart rate variance and whether or not people can actually improve that to the sense that they can actually improve their ability to handle stress at a physiological level. So taking all of that, sitting down and thinking about where the Games for Health space should go and talking about this the last couple of years, I really was frustrated. I'm trying to figure out how can we really reach the pinnacle of what we mean when we think about all the power and opportunity that comes from games, game technologies, and the people who live and breathe and build these things. And I sort of said to myself, what could be a guiding principle here? And for me, I started thinking about my friends who build games for any kind of opportunity, entertainment especially. And when they sit down as artists, they're thinking about what is something that I want everybody to play my game. What are the games everyone should play? And I wrote that down, and then from that became the spark to talk about sort of a different way of looking at this space, as opposed to looking at it from a specific disease state or problem state. So instead, what if we had games that weren't disease-based, that they had the ability to really line up well with consumer business and distribution models, that they could affect multiple health issues, that they could be ideally global in terms of their scope, and that you ideally are immediately healthy after playing it. Now, there may be an immediate decay that follows that, right? Like, I get on a treadmill, I run for 30 minutes, not barring other physiological functions, I'm likely healthier for that. But of course, if I don't run again for another 3 years, it's probably not great. But if I learn to, say, cook some healthy foods one afternoon, and then I keep cooking them, maybe that one instance did not have the same sort of decay rate, right? So they can have these different things. And ideally, these offer population health effects. And through these games, we could address some of that new health model and health literacy needs. So these became this sort of extrapolation of what are the attributes that we wanted to sort of see. And then we sort of said, what fits in that? And so we started talking about a variety of games that we felt had those principles. So we talk about a general game called Healthy Me. So this would be sort of replace the textbook that you get in high school about what it means to be a healthy human being. And instead you play something that really plays that out. Risky Me would be the notion of that, part of that health curriculum that doesn't necessarily get adapted very well, is that we actually invite risk into our lives through really, either poor or poor decision making or even understanding sort of brain development of teenagers. We seek risk. Looking at drugs, smoking, STDs, alcohol, probability, then looking at these areas like nutrition, exercise, self-diagnostics, being able to understand whether or not you're sick or not, first aid, looking at things like around health behavior economics, people opting out of vaccines, we don't want that, looking at people's understanding of infectious health, not only so that they seek help, but also we reduce panic, which is just almost an even bigger problem. We saw that with the Ebola news that took place, and looking at health finances and consumption. So looking at how people actually spend and consume healthcare. We have lots of overconsumers, we have underconsumers, and for different reasons. And then looking at, again, at some of the social, emotional, and cognitive health areas. So there are areas where we think we could build and see games, let alone apps or other things, and all of these areas that really fit that model. And as a result, like if we could build these games and put them out on the types of services that have that virality, and that have that consumer engagement, whether it be Xbox Live, the iPad App Store, Congregate, which is a sort of web portal of games, Steam, Origin, which is EA's service, other types of things. Ideally, we want to hit everybody. But if we build these games the right way, we can hit at least some of that population very, we're almost kind of hitting the population indiscriminately in a good way. We don't have to necessarily seek the diabetic, through a gateway that we can only reach them through. And then ideally, they're better not only for themselves, but for everyone else around them. The person who plays a cooking game and learns to cook better for themselves is also cooking better for the next person who's going to be served food in their household. The person who's taking care of themselves from preventing an STD is not only preventing their own acquisition of STD, but everybody else around them. I mean, this is just, public health 101. An example of this is some of the work that we've done with the Yale School of Medicine with Play Forward. So Play Forward started out as a game where we were thinking about ostensibly HIV prevention, but when we really unpacked and understood what HIV prevention would be for middle school students, it really became a larger understanding of how to avoid risk vectors related to drugs, alcohol, sexual risk-taking, and risk in general, to really learn to cope and be able to navigate risky situations in a better way. And so we've built this larger game, which is in a clinical trial now, that we hope is starting to give them, the experimental group, a better capacity to avoid these situations at a higher level of frequency, such that when we measure them out, we see not only behavior change, knowledge gains, but actual lower incidence of self-reported verified instruments around drugs, alcohol, and sexual risk-taking. And we'll see if we're able to accomplish that. But again, this is a game everyone can play. This is a game that everyone who's going through 6th, 7th, 8th grade, let alone higher up, can play and potentially benefit from, so long as the game is imparting beneficial information with little side effect. Here's some other games, just in general. This is a game that is around preventing injury for grocery store workers, and this is a group out of Pittsburgh. So you'd be surprised what the workman's comp is for just even cashiers. Achille Interactive Labs is a startup founded by Adam Gazalet at UCSF, and he has been looking at this notion of attention and improving the ability to intent through playing different types of games. And they've actually spun the work out of the lab. This was a RWJF Health Games research grant that then resulted in a paper in Nature, and now is part of a startup that's actually based here in Boston that was funded through Pure Tech Ventures here. And this actually all came together at the Games for Health conference. They met each other and they started working on this. And so there's been some articles about Adam's work and Achille that you can find on the web. And they're going for FDA approval for some of this as a therapy, and this is sort of this emerging area of neurotherapeutics, and then using games as sort of the delivery, let alone the instantiation mechanism for this kind of idea. When we did Play to Prevent, when we did Play Forward, we thought about this notion of future health orientation. How could we and we created this idea of the aspirational avatar. So most games have three-dimensional avatars. You put yourself in the game. There's definitely efficacy and research around physical embodiment in games. They also tend to be extremely expensive to do and do well, and we have a budget. So we started thinking, what if we could do some other kind of avatar? And we started thinking, well, what about a scrapbook of your aspirations and your goals, and then putting those goals and aspirations at risk as well. So we started experimenting with these ideas and creating this sort of scrapbooking page that sets that out. And what we're trying to do here is by raising your future, raising the stakes on your future opportunity, we're trying to affect that delayed discounting problem where the cake here looks more valuable than not having a cake for 4 or 5 years over time, right? So by raising the stakes on that, we're trying to bring these more into equality such that you will skip the cake, so to speak. Exercise and activity, Zombies Run. This was a project that was done in the UK, and what was great, it's done by some storytellers that used interactive mediums and games, And this has been quite successful. I think they've done almost $500,000 in App Store sales over time. They've also done a game called The Walk, which was funded by their National Health Service, where they stopped running and just started walking. So really interesting sort of approach. BitGym was a small startup that was just using minor vibrations that they could pick up with the accelerometer on an iPad or using the camera to pick up basically exercise activity. So you could strap the iPad onto a traditional bike, exercise bike, and start to get gameplay out of it. Kudo's game is not a health game, but what's really interesting is this sort of life simulator, and there's a whole range of life simulators beyond The Sims. I just find it really interesting what they did with a whole two-dimensional layout, comic book style art, but then a lot of different factors. So this person actually has to manage their happiness, their excitement, their loneliness, their confidence, their IQ, their culture, their energy, cleanliness, sobriety, health, and weight. I mean, they put health as if none of that other stuff is health. But I mean, really, really interesting game. And I've held this up as saying, you know, why doesn't a health record look more like, you know, Kudo's? And you know, we took some of that idea and applied some of those thoughts in Play Forward. So you know, again, looking at what's going on in regular games and the way they can do things is a great way to establish ideas that might influence us elsewhere, which is really what gamification should have been about. So viral health behavior. So Mary Flanagan up at Dartmouth has done Pox Save the People, both as a board game and as an iPad game. My friend Ian Bogos did Killer Flu. Killer Flu wasn't to necessarily show you how to avoid the flu. Killer Flu was done to show people how hard it is for a flu to turn into that mass bird flu epidemic. Because again, it became this notion of a public health calibration point. You know, before we start worrying about all of a sudden the sky's going to start falling, maybe we need to understand how these things really work. So there have been some first aid games. What I love about this is Staying Alive from iLumens out of France is really that sort of simulation sense of gameplay, right? We find a lot of things in this space of serious games as people try to basically build the world that they see through their camera, through their eyes, and looking at how they can build a highly simulative idea. But you know what? Most people would be best served by just basically doing hands-only CPR. And you know, the funny joke is the song "Staying Alive" actually is the right proper cadence for doing hands-only CPR. So there have been some very funny commercials in the UK and the US getting people to understand that, right, and what to do. So when we were in Canada, we gave a bunch of students this problem. And so a couple of students in the back of the class pulled out a beat matching engine and then replaced all the videos and everything else and basically reskinned it such that they put the music of Staying Alive in there. The beat matching, you had to click with the mouse at the right time, so you were really learning that. We were thinking about eventually then building a mouse that was, you know, a mouse button, a single button game that would allow you to play it, and we could even put it on a mannequin or something. But what was really neat was this beat matching prototype I thought was already better in some ways than iLumens because it's really more of that public health sort of game. It's that game you could play in 10 minutes every 6 months and potentially do something great from it. And so, you know, again, it shows you this idea of that when games are at their best, I think they tend to move away from the real simulative nature and they get into the underlying pattern and opportunity that exists in that problem space. And so, you know, it's the difference between looking at something as a technology and looking at something as an art form. This is totally different from a health perspective, but you know, there's a lot of people looking at the interaction between large data sets and games. And next month at NIH, I'm hosting a meeting of 10 scientists and 10 game developers. All the scientists have big data problems, and we're looking to see what games could do there from a crowdsourcing perspective beyond just more notions of fold-in and iWire, as great as those are. My friend Tim Holt took a huge amount of satellite data and put the entire Oregon forest inside different game engines. So he was taking elevation maps, but then also basically spectral maps that could tell him what was essentially the makeup of the forest floor. And he was putting them inside game engines. So again, it shows you the sort of extent to which you can start to think about that. And thinking about health data, of course, the same way. It could be quite an interesting opportunity. And not only did we think about games that take existing data, but with Robert Wood Johnson, we did last year games to generate data. So there's a lot of opportunities and ideas around this sort of data palooza. The government and others have all these big data sets, and if we could just find new interfaces to interact with them, that would be great. And that's fine, but I thought in terms of doing something different, we would look at the way that games generate new data and to think about ways that we could use games in that way. How much time do I have? I'm worrying. I don't have my clock up, so I'd say what? So you want me to end in, say, 10 minutes? Okay. Okay, great. I'm going to skip some things here, but I'll give you some highlights. So, again, this is this notion of whether or not you're looking at ways to help everyone who touches your game or just someone. And I don't want to make the point that doing someone is, in terms of helping a specific disease state, is wrong. I'm just saying that most of the work I've seen here, and I see this in health in general because of the way health is funded, this is where we end up. And what we need to do is figure out how we can rethink not only our approach, but also our funding things. As I said, there's more likely to be an Institute of Pinky Cancer funded because grandma died of pinky cancer before there's an Institute of Grandma did not walk enough or grandma did not eat the right foods for her entire life institute, okay? Now, when we look at the space, we can look at the fact that we have consumers, we have professionals, and workplace, and we look at the ways games can potentially, deal with different areas here. But the most important thing to understand about serious games and games for health, whether it be education or health, is that a lot of our work is about building things that eventually we want to turn into a commercial enterprise, whether it be for sustainability from a social enterprise or pure commerce. The problem is the buyer is not the player, okay? When mom buys that math game, she's not buying it for herself, she's buying it for her kid. Same thing with an employer who rolls out a walking game, they're not buying it for themselves. Whereas when we buy Minecraft, I'm buying it for myself. So there is this inherent friction. So there have been plenty of companies and plenty of businesses built where buyer and user are not the same. But when you talk to VC and other investors, they'll tell you, they'll say, look, this is harder. So I want to understand how you're going to get through that. Right? And I'm not going to give you the answers. So it's a quest, but you need to understand that exists. And especially it exists in this space because so much of the millions and billions that have been built through games that attract people into games in general is where buyer and player are the same. So now all of a sudden you're saying, I want to give you all the greatness of it, but boy, I'm going to take this one really, really, really optimized pathway and I'm going to throw it out the window. I'm going to skip over this. But let's talk about some of the barriers that we have. So when you have a disease state-based approach, you have these population gatekeepers. So you could have a really effective opportunity, but you're still stuck if you can't get a hold of the people who really lead you to the opportunity there. So if you can't get on the dais at a Juvenile Diabetes Foundation large meeting, it doesn't mean they don't like you or your game wasn't effective. They just only had 6 speakers that week, right? The buyer versus the player in terms of that kind of barrier. The fact that a lot of things in health are actually mom and pop shops. We've seen a lot of great work in the rehabilitation space, physical, sensory motor rehabilitation. But when you actually go and look at the market, so many of the people who deliver these services are small individual operators. Okay, so now you have the opposite of those population gatekeepers. You have this, how do I effectively reach all these individual operators who are not necessarily tech-based, who are a little bit reticent to spend money, who are dealing with their own small business issues. So again, as you move out of the lab with something like Play Forward or your own game or whatever technology you're building, you're going to run into these really big, thorny business and social enterprise problems. And again, another thing that we've seen, especially in the health space, is everybody comes forward and they say, I've got a game, and you could put something else instead of game, and it's going to save you, Humana, a bunch of money because less people are going to go to the emergency room. The funny thing is that the people that the healthcare companies send out to all the technology conferences tend to come from the Chief Innovation Office. And guess what they're charged with? Not saving money, growing revenues. So you literally are talking about something that they are not charged with dealing with. As much as it seems natural that we would have this great product that would lower their reimbursement costs, the person sitting there is saying, I've been charged by the CEO to go find new businesses, new things to start that grow our revenue. And all you have to do is watch CNBC for a little bit to understand this problem. When the CEO shows up, and it's dueling CEOs, and one CEO announces that they have cut costs but revenues are flat, guess what happens to their stock? Their profitability went up, by the way, as a percentage. But guess what happens to their stock? It goes down. The other CEO has, our margins decreased a little bit. That can sometimes ding you. But we grew top line revenues by 6%. Guess what happens to their stock? It goes way up. And the reason is because they don't believe that you can keep cutting costs all the way through for years and years and years. But they do believe if you keep hitting your revenue goals, that can keep up. And that you'll worry about costs that 1 year and you'll bring it back into line. But I'd rather back the revenue horse than the cost horse, which is a real big problem. I mean, but it's an eye-opening when you finally hear. I literally was in a room and the person from the large health company said, "Stop, this is not my job. Give me something that can make us money." And we're not talking by saving. So, again, you have these issues of capital formation, your efficacy. These are all barriers that you're going to deal with here. Now, I'm going to have to skip. Here's another issue. We used to talk about how the game itself would work, and all the money went into the game. So like something like Remission, that went in. Now we're building smaller games. We're getting better at holding their costs in line. We're being more creative with what represents a game. It's not always thinking about it in that terms of big console game equals game. But the whole need to deliver all of this as a service, to have back-end connected systems, to have all the things that really do take a piece of software and turn it into a connected health platform, that's the real battle now. And most developers in most labs do not produce anything that comes out of the lab with this, okay? And so that's a big problem. So let me just skip ahead. So now you see that there are these platforms coming forward, like Health, and Google has their own, and there's some others. And so what's going to happen is, we're going to have this back-end services war, but the question is, do we now align ourselves with these other platforms, or do we have to extend? How do we do that? And who's going to own those platforms, and is that important to me or not? And then we've got new platforms, sensors, and all of these other things. And I'm very enamored with the potential for the watch. My friend Zach Gage said, hey, if I can build games for this thing, I am totally doing that. Now, what's interesting about this is Zach does not make serious games. He did Ridiculous Fishing, he did Spell Tower, he builds entertainment games. But the moment entertainment developers are developing on a platform like the watch that really is got health sensors and gets access to it, they're gonna start thinking about how they combine those things, but they're not necessarily gonna be thinking about it from health. But if all of that health data as a result of his play is still feeding into these systems, he essentially becomes a health game developer by happenstance. Now, all of a sudden, we could potentially be competing against people like Zach. Let me tell you, I don't want to compete against Zach. I want to help Zach. So it could be a very new world where all of a sudden, instead of having to build the entire stack ourselves, like the way Runkeeper or MapMyFitness did, or even Jawbone Up, that we really start to enable an ecosystem of game developers who are competing for the front end, but are aligned with someone else's back end. And now, all of a sudden, the person who can build the one game if Jawbone built their own game and then put it on their own platform, they're now going to be competing with the Zacks of the world. And so that is going to be very, very interesting. A couple of other things we're doing. We've been building a prototyping kit on paper for nutrition games because we can't figure out the world's best nutrition game. So we want to see if we could figure out how to build a whole cadre of hundreds, if not thousands of people building simple little card-based, board-based games about nutrition, or about food, really. Instead of nutrition, we want it to be about food. And then these then become the prototypes that we turn into electronic prototypes. And so we've been looking at how you can build basically paper-based game platforms. And so we have a plan for these kits. And then I will show you one other piece, because it's not showing up here. We've been doing the same for a mobile active game. engines. So we said, what if we made the world's first mobile active game engine, and if we could enable people to be human joysticks, where your actions are the joysticks? And so the funny thing is there's a lot of great data about walking. In fact, Clive Thompson did a wonderful article in the New Yorker many years ago where he went on a quest to figure out why are New Yorkers so damn healthy, because you wouldn't associate New York City and health together if you weren't living there. And when I was at my best peak performance of health, I lived in New York. And the reason is he goes through everything. He looks at all the different things. And then when he finally comes to the realization of it's because New Yorkers walk everywhere and they walk fast. And in fact, why do people in cities walk fast? And so the Atlantic has done other talks, and then it turns out that actually not only are we becoming more urbanized and as a result walking, but people in different cities walk at different rates. And when I told Verizon this, they got really interested. So we could literally turn on your pedometer and ask and have a higher confidence level where you're from, let alone where you are. It's like the old Eric B. and Rakim lyric, right? It's not where you're from, it's where you're at. So there's a lot of prior art in walking games. And so what we've done is we thought about the fact that really the largest, I've been doing a lot of work with accessibility in games because I find that really interesting. And then I brought it together because I started to realize the largest world of visually impaired gamers are people who are out and walking around. Because you cannot play a game with the iPad 3 inches from your face when you're running down the street. So we thought about how we could take all these audio-only game engines and be influenced by them and the way we could respond to environments and thinking about wearables. And we've created something that we call Mealy 1.0, which I'm sad to say should have been out by now. It's mostly done, but there's a lot of other supporting infrastructure I'm putting in place. And Mealy basically is a JSON-based engine running on PhoneGap, so it's on multiple platforms, where you basically have to have a rudimentary understanding of programming, and you can build your own sort of zombies run. You can build basically any game that takes a sensor on the phone. Right now, pedometers mostly, but we're trying to work into heart rate and others. And you can basically output conditional variables to an audio-based output, let alone screen color, LED, force feedback, other things that could be what I would call a glanceable UI. And we're trying to eventually extend it and build it as this will be open source sometime late this year, maybe next year, certainly in the next few months. And what you could do is you could build all kinds of things with it. You could build action games, you could build narrative strategy games, RPGs, you can build anything with it. And as a result, you're basically relying on the human's physical activity. And so what we've tried to do is make this easier for people to do. So this allows somebody in an afternoon of work to build something that is a rudimentary form of something that Zombies Run took several months to do. Now, we can't recreate Zombie Run's amazing narrative and audio production, but that's up to you. But you don't have to have the programming behind it. And this is what we mean by games for everyone. Walking is the most baseline, most scalable thing that we can do as a population to improve people's health. Almost every single person on the planet can walk. Yes, there's some who can't, but we can help them in other ways. This is what we're trying to get at. Instead of building running games for athletes, I want to build walking games for everyone. So that's what I've been up to. I'm happy to take a few questions. I'll be around as long as I can. Thanks. And I did bring a copy of Play Forward if at some point I can show off, but I don't want to use up more time.
I enjoyed your presentation, and I think games have a lot of potential. My comment or question has to do with some possible negatives and whether they're being given adequate attention. First of all, whether the game is more likely to replace other modes of learning or supplement other modes of learning. There is currently a tendency for videos to be replacing text. Now, videos take for information on the web, health, anything, just, simple stuff, not related to games. And I find, and people acknowledge, and tests have been done, that it takes longer to watch a video than to read the text of what's being presented, because we could read much faster. And so you're slowing people down. Also, Well,
it depends. I think what we're talking about is what I said at the beginning, right? How do we see comparative advantages, right? And comparative advantages can also be situational.
Yes, but if you're conveying information through a game and it is not otherwise available to read, then one, the student may miss subtle cues that are being presented or certain associations that could be explicit in text. Two, text you can highlight and go back and quickly summarize what was a chapter's worth of material by just flipping the pages. You can't do that with a game. You can't do that easily with with video, I mean, audio or video.
But I don't think I'm trying to get into a debate over whether one's better or not.
Well,
I think they're all situational.
I'm not trying to, I'm just trying to raise cautions.
I think those cautions are well valid.
Right.
I agree.
And so, for example, one easy solution would be to have games supplement textual material.
Sure.
So one had the alternative. Also, to the extent that students learn to seek games because they're entertaining and they're fun and they learn and the teacher says to do it, then decreases their frequency of using regular learning by reading. And so it biases them to seek entertainment out of everything they do, biases them. I don't mean
hold on.
an all or nothing.
Time out. I don't know if I would call regular learning meaning reading. I mean, when we had the oral tradition, was regular learning oral tradition and reading was something new? I think what you're getting at is this. Look, I think what you're getting at is this. There are many things where games might be inefficient, okay? Yeah. In fact, there's a number of things. Civilization is a very inefficient way to learn about history, okay? But when someone has played Civilization for quite a while, their ability to understand certain types of frameworks and to be able to talk about those frameworks and then go back to text, and this has been shown too, and learn better, may have an opportunity. What we are charged with, you're coming at this also from an entirely instructional learning standpoint. A lot of things in health behavior change are not necessarily instructional and learning based.
I'm just raising cautions.
Let me finish. The Mealy Game Engine is not there to replace text, okay? The Mealy Game Engine is there to create an interesting way to get out in the world and do more, okay? So the point is this. I agree with you 100%. Just blindly taking a game or a video or any other piece of media and substituting it in and calling it teaching or learning is completely invalid.
Okay.
The point, though, and this was one of my first slides, I do believe, and I understand I'm kind of turning this into an argument for the sake of making a point. One of my first slides was this. The comparative advantages. Inherent in that discussion, and it is a piece of text, is exactly what you're saying. Yes or no?
I'm not sure I get your point there.
If I'm seeking to make available comparative advantages,
Right.
and I come up null, what am I reinforcing? I'm reinforcing that there was not a comparative advantage, much like you say there's a comparative advantage for certain pieces of text-based learning.
I don't see anything wrong with games supplementing or video supplementing.
No, I think games should replace certain things when it's shown that they are a superior opportunity. But I'm not going to claim that I found those. I'm claiming that that's what I'm seeking. And also, in some cases, and in many cases, they should be multimodal, transmedia-based systems. And I think that's what we're all talking about.
Well, comparison and verifying that it gives an advantage so it should replace raises questions about how a comparison is done. If you just for a moment, because prostate tests have not been shown to be effective because harmful they've been shown, because doctors misuse the information and then do biopsies which have side effects and do other medication rather than watch and wait, because doctors misuse it, the FDA says don't do prostate testing. Right. So that's an example.
There's an example in games, right? Lumosity creates a false sense that you don't have to eat a good diet and exercise to have brain health. Why? Oh, I'm taking care of my brain. Oh, why? How are you doing that, Grandma? Oh, I'm playing lots of Lumosity. Hey, how about going for a walk too?
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
That's why we're talking about comparative advantages.
Thanks. I really enjoyed your talk.
Mm-hmm.
So growing up, I grew up playing games. I love games. I love health as well. I think a lot about how I can be healthy, working out, things like that. When I think about games for health and why we're so interested in this, I think like the ultimate game for health is sports, right? Because sports are a game that like are addictive and fun, and like you can go and play, and like you get healthier by playing sports, right? And I think when you talk about why like the CEOs of these companies are so interested in games is because their kids aren't playing sports anymore, or aren't like going outside.
I don't
and
know if
playing
that's
as much.
necessarily true, but let's take your sport point for a fact,
Sure,
right?
sure.
So we know from other studies that we've seen that there's a whole cadre of kids, for one reason or another, shun sports, and they're legitimate for it. They do not have psychology around team. They do not like hyper-competitive situations and the people who follow. Dimitri Martin, the comedian, once said that deciding on which board game to play that night was a giant episode of trying to figure out which one of his friends was the biggest asshole, okay? And so what ends up happening is, sports, I totally agree with your point about sports, and there's been some really interesting ideas like the Come Out and Play Festival that look to create new types of sports as games, whether they be electronic or otherwise. The point though is that I've seen research that shows that there are kids who fall through that. And creating ideas around like things like a single player episode of Dance Dance Revolution is shown to reach some of those kids, right? So everything is going to be situational, and we have to figure out how do we take an existing situation, layer in something that ideally could be better, integrate it, to come back to this gentleman's point, and again, build something that is ideally offering a comparative advantage, defining what that comparative advantage is, and then hoping that that is enough, along with other work, to scale it to essentially being a public health advantage. So I think the notion of sports makes sense. But I'd be very cautious about having seen a lot of the psychology when people, there's a large number of people when put into a competitive environment, immediately withdraw. And that's something that comes along with sports that we don't do very well overall in this country.
Right. I mean, yeah, fair enough. I think like a lot of the kids that are playing these competitive games are very competitive though. But anyways, my thoughts were just that like, when you're talking about kids, they often play games for their mastery, you know what I mean? Like to get really good at these games, and like you can do that in sports, and that like you can get really good at shooting a soccer ball or basketball. But like things with the Wii Fit, it's actually really hard to like. It's such a low resolution thing, like if you ever played like Wii Boxing or something. It's like you can't really be better than someone at Wii Boxing.
Right, which is, but even then there isn't. Even if it's a single player game, the idea of mastery is not very well affected in something like Wii Fit, right? Or Wii Boxing. But there have been other games where people have taken those very notions and said, wait a minute, we know these other types of ideas work. Maybe we should be building extra games that envelop those things. The bigger problem that I see, taking your point, in extra games, just to use that as an area of activity, is that we've seen too much single episodic sort of builds. And what I want to see are more engines that allowed it, like Melee, where people could build something in an afternoon, and then all of a sudden we can get 1,000 extra games. Because this notion that we're going to build the world's best extra game, and I'm not saying that's what you're saying, but where this sometimes leads is to this notion of if we could just build the best game ever, then all of a sudden everybody would play. But what we really need are systems that allow us to build thousands of extra games so that we have that seductive, ubiquitous, pervasive accessibility to finding the games that we like and that we want to play and that fit all these psychologies that we know are out there that we have to do. And one of them will be your game, and one of them will be my game and her game. And that's what we really need, and that we're not there yet.
So my point is kind of related to Tharik's, and in this class we talked a lot about advertisement and how an ad for Coke is maybe in many ways doesn't have the constraints that an ad for like contraceptive use may have, right? It just has more space to work with. So then how do you compete with entertainment games? Can a serious game compete with Grand Theft Auto in terms of how engaging?
It's not supposed to, right?
That is, you are competing for that attention, right?
Yeah, but the way that, so the issue there is there may be some games that can do that, right, from time to time, but ultimately we can't take someone who is so completely unmotivated and flip them on their head. What we have to be doing is offering utility, right? And I pick up a cookbook mostly because I want to cook something great. I don't necessarily, and although there are people who read cookbooks for entertainment, I don't necessarily read cookbooks for entertainment, but I own 50 cookbooks, okay? And I read other books for entertainment. I mean, the problem with games, and we've seen this, and this comes out of almost game culture, is that it's almost so overly focused on entertainment that, you know, Gamergate, half of that is about sort of saying, don't ever bring anything else into my entertainment other than that. But that's completely insane. And so what we have to do is recreate this notion of utility, and that games can provide utility. Because that utility is what the person will regress to when the game finally wears off or isn't as good as Grand Theft Auto. I don't want to replace Grand Theft Auto. I want to replace whatever is not that much fun to do while walking. I want to replace, you know, the way a diabetic has to learn. Okay? Yes, I want to increase the number of diabetics who learn about how to take care of themselves or cook better because I'm being a more entertaining form, like Cooking Mama. Okay? But you know what? You can go to lots of people who play only entertainment games and say, here's Cooking Mama, which we all agree is an entertainment game, and they won't play that either. But at the end of the day, if you go and you offer someone only entertainment, and then but you stealthily are hoping to provide them utility, then you have basically declared that you are going to try and compete with Grand Theft Auto. Why would you want to do that? At the same time, there's even ethical notions of informed consent. Stealth health and stealth learning, hello, that has a very, you know, slippery path. What I want is informed consent and also hyper notion of utility, because when that game is just not the most perfect game, I want to have why am I playing that? Because you know what? I want to learn how to cook this really good meal. And so you got to kind of find the way where you're doing both, but don't sell entertainment before you sell utility. I think that's a long-term disaster.
Thank you for a great talk. I had to miss a part of it. I apologize. But first, I want to contest the fact that—
I could start over.
Let's do that too. I think I want to contest the fact that Grand Theft Auto is all about entertainment. I know a couple of people whose math skills improved, logic skills
Yeah, I mean,
improved.
this is a totally flip. By the way, do you know what happens when you run fast in Grand Theft Auto? Anybody know?
You get tired?
No. Your health goes up.
Okay, never noticed.
Interesting.
I don't really play it much, but my question is about the possibility of having a symbiotic relationship with such games. So I could teach you linear algebra through StarCraft strategy without you even realizing you're learning linear algebra. So there might be a big opportunity to ride this wave of primarily the stuff that we call entertainment only, which I think is not entertainment only. And
I would agree with you, but yeah.
So any thoughts on that?
But well, first off, there's this notion of what has the user been given as a perceptive. And what we find also sometimes is that, especially with younger kids, when you have a game that has an overly metaphorical message, even though mechanically it's trying to do that, we find that the transfer is not very good. Where that transfer tends to happen, like with linear algebra inside, say, something like StarCraft or others, when the teaching person, when the teaching moment comes in. So that requires the human to come back into the equation and connect those dots, right?
What I meant is creating a game that the person would use because they think it would teach them how to be better at StarCraft. But really that game is teaching them linear algebra.
Well, so then you're still giving them a utilitarian point, and that's fine. I mean, I would just say that it's important to not think that you can just that entertainment isn't necessarily the shell around the pill, okay? And so I still think very much that we have to provide a sense of utility. And I think also one of the things and this goes with learning games as well, I find this larger notion that there is this sort of sense out there. We use games to do X because kids love games and kids are lazy, and games will solve both of those problems, right? Well, you know what? That's just really wrong, okay? It's really, I mean, this is how, I mean, I know a lot of kids who should be angry that that's the way we think of kids blindly when we create things like this. So I think we really have to look at the ethics of some of these notions. I think some of these notions offer design vectors, but I think they come with some really, really underthought ethical vectors, let alone underappreciation for our audience, and expectations too.
think this is
Go
your
ahead.
last question.
Sorry.
I studied obesity prevention at Penn State, and in the food space, you said earlier that health interventions or mobile applications in general rely on self-report too much. So I'm wondering if there are examples of games that get at that sort of underlying behavior of obesity and food choice, rather than simulation or self-report.
The general answer, without really being fully caught up to speed, is no. What I think that there's opportunities to do those kinds of games. I think that one of the problems is, again, we have the people who are building these kinds of games really under-supported. They either don't understand game design very well, or they don't understand nutrition very well, or they also have bad targeting. So somebody asked me, what was the game I would build with Nom Nom, our prototyping kit? And I said, I'd build a game about shopping for food, because half the problem is that the decision's already been made by the time the person gets home. And I want to get them where they're making the bad decision to start. And everybody was like, whoa, wait a minute. And I was like, yeah, well, because again, most people don't actually think about the problem. They think the problem is, way down, further down the stream. And there are problems there. But again, it becomes about, can we get the right people around and support them? And that's what we're going to try and do with Nom Nom, is get a game prototyping kit that allows nutritionists to be able to build better games out of the box so they're not building Catch the Fruit, and then game designers to take these things and go, oh, I didn't know that these were the things that mattered. I didn't know that we don't have to worry about measuring out sodium. We just have to know there are things that cross a threshold of sodium, almost like binary, right? Like, it's really funny how a lot of food choices and understanding, we tend to build these apps that are about calorie counting. You could actually do it with like 5 questions. You could just literally ask people, how many times last week did you have fast food? And you could literally take the sorting hat in like 2 questions and go, I think we need to work with you. And then and all before we even get to like hyper dictionaries of which work, but then they work if people adhere to them, but nobody ever does.
I think we're out of time, but we have a few more spots available for the lunch if anyone wants to join us in a discussion. I bet. No?
He's tired of me talking.
Maybe too healthy.
All right.
So thank you very
well, thank
much,
you very
Ben,
much. I'm
for
glad to have been
great
here.
talk.